sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 17, Short Feelings. Sat in her usual spot beneath the best window on the train, Vivian opened up her laptop to stare at a blank page on the screen. The tech was as old as it was rare, much slimmer and sleeker than her usual, and preferred, travelogue handheld typewriter. But the boss wanted the article to feel genuine. She had been tasked with researching the recent decline in Kunskopian trade with Levermorn. As the #1 source of high-end technology salvage, their absence had the elders worried. She pressed her fingers into the keys, testing a few opening lines when the compartment door rattled hard. She jolted, her instincts forcing her to slam shut the laptop, an act that would have the elder cleric sobbing if they knew, and her eyes jerked to the cause of the commotion. Outside her tiny compartment was a massive, and I mean truly massive, dog. It was just staring at her, paused in the motions of licking the window of the door, its nose pressed flat against the glass. Vivian would have laughed, if not for the 4-inch canines lining the animal's jaw. "Duck, get away from there! Leave that poor lady alone!" Indiga tugged on the dog's collar like a pair of reins, getting him to back away with only a short whine of protest. He offered the woman an apologetic wave as they continued down the cramped hallway. "Sorry, wrong compartment." Eric pinched the bridge of his nose, having heard the pair coming, and reached over with his other hand to open their own door, allowing in the monstrous mutt. He grumbled when Duck's tail slapped him in the face. Sitting in his seat by the corner, Artemis glanced up from his research and rolled his one eye. "This room is too small for that beast. You should have loaded him into one of the cargo containers, or left him behind." Overlooking the hopeful tone of that last suggestion, Indiga shot the necromancer a dirty look. "Funny, I was just thinking the same about you." Eric tossed his own journal onto the cushion beside him with a groan. "Can I get just 1 hour of peace from the two of you, please?" "All I did was make a suggestion." Artemis buried his nose back into his research. "Not my fault he can't take a joke." "Ha! Telling me to leave my service animal behind." Indiga flopped back into his chair on the opposite side of the compartment, after convincing Duck to lay down at his foot. "Real funny." Snapping shut his book, Artemis turned, leveling a questioning gaze at the Selkie. "What is your problem with me?" Other than being a necromancer, yes." There was a terrible throb behind Eric's eyes now, a deep pulsing of tension and, honestly, anger. 3 hours into their journey to Kunskop, and his two traveling companions refused to stop bickering. Around and around in a death spiral they went, rehashing old complaints and bringing up that time we almost drowned saving your hide. It was odd. Indiga got along with everyone. Everyone except the one other person in their party. The pain in his head reached a peak when Duck joined in the bickering, as he always did, with high-pitched whines and sing-song howls. "Enough!" Eric stood, abandoning his journal as he reached for the door. "I've had enough!" He whirled on the pair of them, first Artemis, then Indiga. "Solve this! Whatever your issues are need to be seen to before we reach the station." He closed his eyes, sucking down an agitated breath to center himself. "I'm tired of the bickering." Indiga leaned forward. "Look, I don't care. I'm going to get a coffee. When I get back, you two will have figured this out. If nothing else, you'll at least find a way to ignore each other for the rest of the journey." As Duck began to whine, he cut the dog off with a pointed gesture. "That goes for you, too!" The silence in the room told Eric his companions agreed, or at least knew better than to protest. He stomped out into the hallway and slammed shut the compartment door as he set off to find the dining car. As soon as he was fairly certain Eric was out of earshot, Indiga threw himself back into his cushion and folded his arms across his chest. "Now look what you've done." Artemis ran his finger across his forehead, flattening the creases in his brow as he glanced over at the Selkie. "What I've done? You're the one that has had it out for me since the moment I told you what I'd do." He put his hand up when the other man clicked his tongue against his teeth in disapproval. "I get that you don't like necromancy, but I'm not about to apologize for who I am." "It's not just that. You're hiding something." Indiga slapped a hand against his stomach. "I've had a gut feeling about you ever since we met, and I want to know what it is." "I'm not hiding anything." "Oh, really?" Indiga reached for the bag saddled to his giant dog and pulled out a printed sheet of paper, slapping it on the small flip-down table that sat between them. "Did you know that the hotel gives each guest an itemized bill of services at the end of their stay, even if everything was comped?" Artemis froze, his one eye flicking down to the paper. "See, that drop in the color of your skin tells me you are hiding something." Indiga tapped the sheet. "Quite a few things on here caught my attention, not least of which was the—" He pointedly ran a finger along the line. "Fee for the disposal of animal remains." "And would you prefer I experiment on a person instead?" "I would prefer you not to experiment at all." Artemis forced a pained, condescending smile on his face. "Look, I could explain the subtle nuances of my craft to you, but I doubt you'd be smart enough to understand. I had a theory. It failed, but that is how progress is made." "Failed theory, huh? Is that what got you sentenced to the drowning pole?" Indiga sat back, his hardened gaze never wavering. "Did you dig someone up from the cemetery and get caught?" Artemis turned away, flipping open his book again. "Why I was out in the ocean is irrelevant, same as your grievance. And in case you forgot, you were both sentenced to that pole right next to me." "Why are you even here? Why not go murder woodland creatures somewhere else?" He paused, his pen hovering over a blank page. "I have my reasons." "Oh yeah, that doesn't scream, 'I'm up to something.' Not at all." Indiga pulled the paper closer to himself. "Eric is on a quest for the gods. His life depends on this. I'm not going to let you lead him astray." "Astray?" Artemis set down the pen, frowning at the Selkie as he did. "What are you, his mother?" "I'm here because I saved that man, and he's my responsibility. I can tell he needs someone to balance out his chaos, a voice of reason." Indiga tapped the paper with a finger. "I wanted to give you the chance to explain this to me, but I think I'll show it to Eric and have you explain it to him instead. Maybe then he'll get rid of you." Artemis slammed shut his book and stood, snatching the paper and manically shredding it. "Listen, you simple-minded fishmonger! I've endured worse than you on my way here, and if you want to act like a wet nurse, go right ahead, but I will not be stopped by the likes of you. Wanna bet?" Indiga clicked his tongue twice, and Duck lunged, teeth bared and hackles raised. A paw the size of a flour sack smashed into the necromancer's chest, crushing him to the floor. Artemis tasted blood as his head rebounded off the metal surface. He raised a hand to his mouth, fingers gently touching his lower lip to find it split. Well, blood was an excellent conduit. Waste not, want not, he thought, as he sank his red fingertips into the beast's fur, pressing down until... With a shrieking yowl, Duck scrabbled away, tail between his legs. "What did you do?" Indigo was clutching his friend in an instant, eyes wide with fear. "Stay back." Artemis tried to crawl towards the hall, but as he reached the door, he found his way blocked. "What the hell?" Eric stood there, holding a paper cup of coffee in one hand. "Attacking each other is not what I meant by work it out." Indigo was still clutching his dog. "He tried to kill Duck." Eric looked down. "You did?" "Of course not." Artemis shook his head. "I didn't hurt him at all. Just gave his soul a good tug." Panic flooding through him, Indigo scoured over his howling dog as though he might be able to somehow spot the damage to Duck's soul. "How is that any better?" Eric pinched the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes. "Not cool, man." "He attacked me first." Indigo shot a hateful glare at the necromancer. "Only because he's up to something. We need to get rid of him before he does whatever he's planning." "No, I'm not." Artemis glanced between the two, and when the look on the man's face betrayed suspicion as well, his eyes went wide with fear. "Really?" Running a hand through his hair, Eric let out a long sigh. The Selkie wasn't the only one getting a bad vibe. Maybe he was right. "Listen, I think—" "No!" Artemis's fingers fumbled around the hem of Eric's pant leg. "Please, I swear, it's not what you think." Indigo swung a hand down, gesturing at the torn bits of paper. "I had proof, but it shouldn't matter. Can't you see he's evil? Why else would anyone become a necromancer?" He glanced down at that pathetic, desperate man staring at him, and Eric realized with a start that you're missing your brig. The two men froze, but for very different reasons. Indigo's face screwed up in confusion. His what? Kneeling down before him, Eric stared intently at Artemis. "In my time, I've met a few alternate variants of you. Different versions on every world I've visited. None of them are the same except for one thing. They all had a counterbalance, a friend. But you..." He frowned sympathetically. "You're alone." He looked over to the Selkie. "That's why someone would become a necromancer. To bring someone back." Although he could feel their gazes on him, Artemis refused to meet them as he pushed himself to his knees. He reached for his book of research that lay splayed open on the floor, and his jaw worked back and forth for several seconds before he found his words. "I've done everything I can with the knowledge I have access to, but it's not enough. I need more." He finally looked up, his attention focused solely on Eric. "That's why I've been following you." His eyes flicked to the torn shreds of paper. "I experiment on animals to learn as much as I can, but they don't have a mind. Sometimes I need..." Artemis stopped, the words bitter in his throat. "I need people. That's the reason I was sentenced to the drowning pole. I saw the townsfolk in Firthwell burying their dead, so I waited." His shoulders slumped. "I can bring back the body, but not the mind." "You couldn't ask for permission first?" Indigo scoffed, but there was less bite in it than before. "Would you agree?" A sort of tenuous kinship blossomed inside Eric. He and the necromancer shared a similar feeling of loss, of disequilibrium. He held out a hand to help the man to his feet. "What was his name?" Artemis accepted the gesture and stood, still not meeting his eyes. "Bosley Burt." Unable to stop himself, Eric let out a snort of laughter, but then stopped. Sorry. A smile cracked across Artemis's face. Don't be. It's a horrible name. You're not actually buying this sob story, are you? Indiga threw out a hand, his face twisting in disbelief. He lost somebody. That sucks. I'm sorry. It happens. What he's doing is wrong, and people can get hurt. Many often believe the pursuit of science is wrong. Indiga interrupted, shouting, "This isn't about the science!" Look. Eric turned toward the Selkie, his tone becoming icy. I'm the one with the body count, not him. I'm the one the gods are worried about. So before you skewer him over a flame, remember that. His gaze flickering between the pair, Indiga realized they were a united front. Come on, Duck. He gave his dog a loving shake, then pulled himself up on his back. Let's go find another compartment. As he moved between the two men, neither of them stopping him, Indiga caught a flash of a haughty smile on the necromancer's face, and something soured in his gut. He clicked his tongue against his teeth as he stepped out into the hall. There was still something Artemis wasn't telling them, and he was going to figure out what it was. Dread practically oozed from his pores as Lucas walked down that familiar hallway. He jumped the gap, casting a curious glance down into its darkened depths. He gave it a tentative wave and muttered, Just fetching something for the manager." He moved that hand to the doorknob and turned it, masking the surprise that flickered across his face when it opened. He half expected a blast of hellfire to engulf him, or maybe a disintegration ray. Wait, did they have those? But as he stepped inside, nothing untoward happened, aside from the unease he felt from standing, alone, in Miranda's office. The floating green balls of fire illuminated the dark as Lucas fumbled around for a light switch. He gave up after a few seconds, afraid he might leave proof of his infiltration, and dropped his hand. He waited impatiently for his eyes to adjust before he set to work scanning, rifling, and digging through whatever he thought might contain their contracts. The few books that lingered between the stone bust figures on her shelves were filled with years of old documentation, photos, and signatures from fated gods. There was one fat folder that was filled with vacation requests, all of them stamped denied, and, according to the label, a box of expired employee name tags. He swallowed hard at that and shoved it back into its dusty corner, unsure if expired meant outdated, no longer employed, or dead. Lucas stood and moved to Miranda's desk. Littered across its surface were stacks of clerical paperwork, personnel files, and requisition reports. He squinted down at the topmost sheet to find a uniform replacement application filled out by one of the room service staff. But nothing here resembled contracts. He reached for the drawers and was not the least bit surprised to find them locked. He scratched behind one of his horns as he glanced around the room. In the dark, the green balls of light cast every stone bust in horrifying relief, and it made Lucas's skin crawl. He was sure their eyes followed him around the room, and that they whispered faintly to one another. Something out of place caught his attention, and he moved closer to it. Dangling from the thin neck of a particularly horrified female figure, sitting atop a stack of papers on the closest filing cabinet, was a key. Lucas reached out and slid the chain over the woman's head and turned the small, silver thing over in his fingers. It looked to be just the right fit. Smiling, he returned to the desk and slid it into the keyhole. With a gentle turn, he heard a lock unlatch, and his heart skipped a beat when the bottom drawer popped open an inch. He reached down and pulled it open fully, to see it stretched well past the size of the desk, nearly bumping into the wall that was 4 feet behind him. His nervous eyes flickered up to the door before he crouched down and, squinting in the dark, began to comb through the folders for a familiar name. Ashton, Balin, Carrot Bell. He quickly thumbed through hundreds of alphabetical files before he found a recognizable last name. DeVore. Oh, his heart skipped another beat. He was half giddy, half furious that Atlas's stupid plan had actually worked. He reached in to pull the file from the cabinet, but it refused to budge. He grabbed the edge with both hands and attempted to pry free the folder, yet it remained in the drawer. Whether by magic or superglue, he wasn't sure. Lucas leaned back, blowing out a puff of air that ruffled his bangs. Well, now what? He frowned at the drawer full of contracts and folded his arms over his chest. Ahem! He jumped hard, painfully banging his shin into the drawer, but he barely noticed. The blood in his veins had turned to ice at the same time a weight sunk into the very depths of his stomach at that bone-chilling sound. He had been so preoccupied with figuring out how to remove their folders that Lucas hadn't even heard the door open. He grimaced. Being turned into stone was not on his to-do list. Gathering his courage and preparing to possibly flirt his way out of this, he swallowed hard and looked up. Sorry, miss. He frowned as his words trailed off. The room was still dark, and he was alone. He glanced to his left, and then to his right. Only the eerie green of the floating fire and the horrified stone faces stared back. Hello?
Welcome to Jaffnaskaro, our only stop in the country of Kunskup.
A voice broke over the crackling intercom, butchering the pronunciation of the town as they pulled to a stop outside a massive station.
If this is your final destination, please claim all luggage and personal belongings in a timely manner. If you are carrying on to Himfeldir, please remain seated and we will depart shortly.
The crackling stopped from the overhead speaker, signaling to the two of them that their tense ride was, at last, over. Eric got to his feet, grabbing his bag from the overhead bin, and slid open their compartment door. None of the other passengers were leaving, save for the woman in the compartment across from theirs. He offered her a friendly smile, but she shot him an irritated glare before flipping up the hood of her parka and exiting the train. As Eric stepped out onto the icy platform, trailed by Artemis, he caught the red taillights of a small electric bike zipping away before the darkness swallowed it. He shivered beneath his dad's heavy coat and rubbed his hands together for some warmth, spinning around in hopes of gaining his bearings. A door opened from one of the cheaper passenger cars, and Duck stumbled out, Indiga riding atop him. Eric waved, a gesture the Selkie mimicked, though less enthusiastically, and turned the dog in their direction. Eric opened his mouth to apologize, but instantly regretted it when Duck slathered his face with slobbery kisses. He gagged and pushed the hound away. I'm not saying we're entirely good yet, but I'm not leaving you out here alone. You need someone with common sense around. Indiga smirked a little before looking at their surroundings, avoiding the necromancer. So, what now? Busy wiping the remaining dog saliva off his face with the sleeve of his coat, Eric nearly missed the Selkie's question. He lifted his shoulders into a shrug as he looked up. I don't know. He shivered, the temperature reminding him of his frostbitten toes and damaged fingers. He stared at them quietly for a moment. He shook the thoughts from his head and glanced around. Aside from Kadiani, every god so far has sent someone to fetch us. Indiga looked around for any sign of a so-called guide. Deep banks of snow had piled up along the edges of the platform, across the tracks, and even threatened to bury the lone lamppost. Unlike the frigid outer reaches of Okari, this place was deathly quiet, punctuated only by their chattering teeth and the departure of the train. It chugged to life, rumbling like a hungry beast before it began to move. The squeal of metal on metal cut into the silence as the train crawled away into the night, leaving them alone in the dark. With the departure of the train and its billowing cloud of smoke, the beauty of Kunskap opened up around them. Eric could hear the distant sound of the ocean somewhere behind him as he looked up and his breath hitched in his throat. The night sky was filled with vibrant green rivers that danced across the radiant stars, his first ever glimpse of an aurora borealis.
"So, you just want to sit out here and wait?"
Indiga, arguably more used to the dangers of the cold than his companions, didn't like the idea of remaining out all night. Interrupted by the sound of crunching snow, Eric stopped his response to squint into the dark. Something massive was lumbering out of the blackness, slowly revealing itself in the limits of light from their lonely lamppost. Resembling a modern muskox from his own time, Eric watched as a shaggy, gigantic horned bull plodded to a stop before him. If the size of the animal was anything to gawk at, which it was, the cart it pulled behind it was astonishingly huge, as was the man that hopped down from the driver's seat. Paul Bunyan came to Eric's mind, and he began searching for the colossal axe he would no doubt use to murder them all with.
"My name is Bolverk, emissary to Obus."
He removed an oil lamp hanging off a hook on his cart and turned to the strangers on the platform.
"I have been sent to collect you. Please join me."
He raised a hand to wave toward the back end of the wagon. As the three of them approached, Eric gulped at the sheer size of him. Being over 6 foot himself meant he didn't often look up when meeting people. But this bear-like man that stood before him caused him to crane his neck to meet his gaze. Bright, golden eyes blinked back at him from beneath a copper mane of decorated braids. Bolverk gestured more aggressively this time to the wagon. Eric jumped into compliance, stumbling toward the cart with Indiga and Artemis in tow. Waiting for them on a bed of straw were several blankets. He grabbed one, wrapping it around himself as he scrabbled to the front of the wagon.
"I'm sorry, Bolverk, was it? Who did you say sent you?"
Artemis climbed up behind him, bundling himself in his own blanket as he found the coziest portion of the straw to nestle into. "Obus, he's the god of death and forgotten knowledge." Indiga glanced quickly at the necromancer, finally understanding why someone would be eager to venture this far north. The wagon teetered dangerously as Bolverk climbed into his seat.
"That is correct."
He let out a low grumble as he gripped the reins with one hand and pulled out a short whip to encourage the beast to move. He glanced over his shoulder, his copper mustache twitching with the smile that appeared on his face.
"You're going to want to sit back. It's a long journey into town, and you will freeze if you don't."
Despite the millions of questions that railed against his brain, Eric did as he was told and slumped back into the depths of the open cart, squeezing in between Artemis and Indiga, in part to prevent any arguments, but also for body heat. Unashamedly, they huddled together for warmth, Duck joining them beneath the blankets, as the ox began to move, a chilly wind descending over them as it did. Guided by the lights from the aurora and the stars, they traveled through the silence for almost an hour before Eric caught sight of any signs of habitation. Dark shapes blossomed out of the ground around them, and he moved to the edge of the cart, staring ahead. They had entered the city, and his eyes lit up with excitement. The intensity of the stars were bright enough that he could spot sidewalks and asphalt, crumbling skyscrapers and towers of metal and stone, darkened street lamps and traffic lights. They were traveling through a modern landscape on a cart pulled by an ox, the two absolute ends of human innovation. He almost slipped out of the wagon, with how far he was hanging over the edge, as they rounded a corner to see vehicles, 4 wheels of rubber and combustion engines, being towed away by other ginormous beasts of burden. He glanced around, realizing that there were no sounds of machinery and no lights that were not the dim flames of oil lamps.
Wait! What's going on here?
They passed by other carts piled high with standard home appliances alongside innovative industrial equipment.
Is that a plasma cutter?
He reached over, tugging on the giant man's woolen coat.
Stop the cart. I need to take a look at that.
Bolverk sniffed, ignoring the half-elf as he encouraged the ox to continue on.
I have my orders to take you to your Tanselicdom.
Huh? Eric's attention wavered between the bear of a man and the construction crane that was in the process of being dismantled as they passed by a group of similarly hulking, rotund figures. While there wasn't a bustling nightlife, it was still incredibly active for the late hour. He tore his eyes away from carts of treasure to look up at the skyscraper, half hidden by the night. He could see the reflection of the stars on some of the window panes, but many of them had been broken. No, not broken, removed. At closer glance, the skyscrapers and buildings he thought to be crumbling were actually...
Are they disassembling the city?
Yes.
Grumbling at the driver's apparent dislike of explanation, Eric waved a hand out.
Why? This is the most technologically advanced city I've seen since arriving.
Bolverk grunted.
Sit back. We're almost there.
Eric flopped back into his spot with a petulant whine, folding his arms over his chest like a scolded child.
What's the big deal?
Indiga stretched his back with a wide yawn.
We have all this stuff back in Okari. A lot of it came from here, actually.
Rubbing at his beard, Eric lost himself in thought. Export? But why would they willingly destroy and sell off their advancements? There was no sign of damage or destruction like that in the wastes outside of Levermorn. This was deliberate, right?
This makes no sense. Oh, quit your pouting. I'm sure there will be plenty of time after you visited this Tanselicdom.
Indiga pulled a face.
Whatever that is.
Artemis leaned forward, pointing to the only glowing structure. That is your Tanselicdom, a place of worship for those of Yafnaskaro. It's said to be brimming with the magic of the divine and knowledge cultivated over centuries. He sighed longingly at the sheer number of possibilities. It's where I've been headed since, well, you know. He leveled off his words with a shrug. Like a lighthouse on a stormy sea, a beacon of illumination burst into view. As his eyes adjusted, Eric laughed at just how similar it was to the St. Basil's Cathedral back in his own world, with its domed spires and gold-capped peaks. One of the towers disappeared into the darkness, spiraling up into the night. Flickering candles shone out from the thousands of glass doors, windows, and mirrors, creating a kaleidoscopic carousel of light. Standing outside of the ornate iron fence was a 15-foot statue. It would have been taller had the head still been attached to it. It wore elegantly carved robes that spilled down over the dais upon which it stood. In one hand, tucked at their side, the statue held a book, and the other hand was pointing toward the horizon, as if to beckon the sun. Bolverk pulled the cart to a stop outside the gate and jumped down. He reached over, grabbing the rope that dangled beneath a decorated bronze bell and rang it loudly several times. Eric hopped out of the back of the cart, stumbling a little as his feet hit fresh snow. Despite wanting to, he found it difficult to keep his gaze away from the figure. It filled him with a sense of unease.
So what's with the headless statue? Is that Obus?
The giant of a man gave a sound somewhere between a growl and a grunt before spitting in the direction of the statue. No, Obus does not allow himself to be depicted. Artemis fell in line beside Eric. This is someone else. Legends say they were once a great unifier of nations and a seeker of knowledge. He moved towards the gates, peering in between the bars, staring up at the glittering structure of stone and wisdom. He founded the great nations of the north, bringing...
We do not speak of the Nameless One. They have brought ruin to our country, and even mentioning their name angers our god.
Bolverk looked away from the statue.
They were stricken from our records, and only exist now as a stain in our history.
Eric grimaced at the way the giant man sneered his response. Then why keep it at all?
As a reminder...
They all turned at the unfamiliar voice to see a doddering old man making his way toward them, his long beard trailing in the snow behind him. Indiga, perched on Duck, approached the others, holding up the lantern.
Oh, looks like the welcome party is here.
Bolverk!
The old man shouted with a jagged tongue as he reached the gates.
You are late.
Like he had been punched in the gut, Eric found himself grasping for words. The person standing before him was not just old, he was ancient, like pried from a sarcophagus ancient. Despite colorful robes of blue and green, his skin was nearly black and pulled taut across his skull. He wore a velvet fez on his head, with a silver tassel that dangled in front of his milky white eyes. His beard, though long, was thin and wispy, like the few strands that covered his balding head.
Forgive me, priest.
Bolverk bowed slightly, gesturing to the others behind him with his hand.
I have brought the pilgrims.
The old man waved his hand furiously, a feat that should not be possible for the dead, Eric thought. You must be a priest of the Udodli. Artemis reached out a shaking hand, as though to touch the ancient being before them. I can hardly believe you're real. The priest changed his focus to the entranced man. He then cocked his head like a bird, sniffed, and recoiled.
High priest, actually, and you reek of the undead.
His glare shifted toward the half-elf.
Obas does not meet with necromancers, or those they affiliate with.
Flicking his robes out behind him, he spun.
I am sorry, but you are denied entrance to Hjortan's Heligdom.
You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
Dang it! I think we're pinned down. Attila. Hey, Attila! Take those damn things out your ears.
Huh? What? Sorry, I was listening to something.
Get your head in the game, man. How many are there?
700.
700? You might be the genius with numbers, but that ain't no 700. I'd say 50 men at most.
Men? Oh! Sorry. I thought you meant podcast episodes.
Podcast? Attila, are you... Holy moly! Are you listening to a podcast in the middle of a firefight?
What? The storytelling is amazing, and I really identify with some of the characters.
Seriously, man?
It's sci-fi and fantasy.
700 episodes, you say?
Yep, 700 and counting.
All right, give me one of those earbuds. Hey, this ain't half bad. Now those are some really good sound effects.
Right?